Alright, ladies and gentlemen, it is Friday. This is the Roulette Productions YouTube channel, and so it is time for another rambling good time with your favorite host with the most. Now, we're going to do a little bit of something slightly different this week. We're going to be discussing some comic book fun. But specifically, we're going to be getting into the idea of legacy identities in a very major way. Now, for real quick, for people who are not familiar with comic books and comic book slang, legacy identity is a secret identity, whether hero or villain, that is used by more than one person in a given given singular timeline, as opposed to the occasional alternate reality minis where you just have alternate versions of a given character. So and legacy identities are a great thing. Some people, they never really legacy out because the characters refuse to stop being published. Superman's a great example. They briefly tease the idea of a legacy identity with the Death and Return of Superman arcs, which we have discussed on a previous video, which I encourage you to watch if you're not familiar with that storyline. But in the end, nobody really took the Superman identity on. And Clark Kent came back from the dead and continued using it. But we're going to talk about a villain legacy identity, not even just a direct one, because when discussing the legacy of this particular costume, it gets pretty spread out. Because we're talking about the Goblin Dynasty. Specifically as it relates to Spider-Man. In many ways, Norman Osborn, the first and most iconic Goblin-themed villain, is Spider-Man's arch nemesis. This hasn't always been so, but he's kind of graduated that position over the years. Now, since then, that has created, mostly because various writers didn't want to overuse Norman, and them eventually killing Norman off, which stayed for a few decades, various other goblins popped up. And we're going to give a quick rundown of all of them to really show you how the base idea of a legacy identity can be taken pretty far, creating not just a simple straight line of inherited costume and code name, but an entire family tree of villainous folks. Now, we are going to stick specifically to the main continuity of the Marvel Comics, what is referred to as Earth 616. We're not going to discuss the previously mentioned alternate reality comic book versions of various Goblin characters, except to say that they do exist out there. We're not going to touch on the movie and video game and cartoon adaptations, except real quick here in passing at the beginning to say that, yes, pretty much every TV show, video game, and movies have had some Goblin character in them. With the exception of the two MCU Spider-Man films, which have focused on other villains, but we don't know what the future brings. We may end up seeing a Goblin of one kind or another in a potential third Spider-Man movie. I mean, I'd be interested in it, but, So, let's go ahead and get our journey started with the Goblin Dynasty. Now, as I said, the original Goblin-themed character to oppose Spider-Man was Norman Osborn. And he, as I said, he used the identity for a while. Chill out, kitty. He used the identity for a while, would occasionally, due to the fact that the Goblin identity is not just technology, like his iconic Goblin glider and pumpkin bombs, but also a, quote, Goblin formula that enhanced his strength, speed, and stamina so he could physically go toe-to-toe with Spider-Man and other superheroes. As such, the Goblin formula would occasionally mess with his head, giving him short-term amnesia, or other situations where he would go an extended period without getting in the costume. And as I said, eventually he would die in battle with Spider-Man, which is where the whole Goblin legacy thing really started picking up. And I'm not necessarily going to do these in chronological order. I'm going to kind of just bounce between the different core Goblin identities. But it all does start with Norman. Since returning from the dead, Norman has been the one and only Green Goblin, although he has occasionally put that identity aside after the Secret Invasion event where Norman manipulated the Great Big War against the invading Skrulls to position himself to the American public as the one who saved the day. Norman found himself in charge of the majority of the superhero community, as this was during the post-Civil War period where the bulk of superheroes and many supervillains pretending to reform were registered with the government and were under government oversight and supervision. Norman found himself in charge of that program and swapped out the Goblin identity for the Iron Patriot identity, which was basically a variant of the Iron Man armor. He mixed his Osborn technology with some partially functioning Stark tech that he had confiscated in his new government-run position, and made himself a new suit so he could have a more heroic identity while manipulating things behind the scenes. This all eventually fell apart. He would go back to the Green Goblin identity for several years, was eventually forcibly given an antidote to the Goblin formula, bonded with the Carnage symbiote, and referred to himself as Red Goblin, but had that removed from him as well. He is currently powerless and hanging out in an insane asylum. However, Norman being Norman, nobody expects him to stay down for long. Now, the second Green Goblin was appropriately enough, especially when discussing legacy identities, Harry Osborn, Norman's son and Peter Parker's best friend. Now, we have seen this play out in the movies, specifically the Sam Raimi trilogy. After Norman's death, Harry being not 100% convinced at the time that his father was a horrible person and a villain and a criminal, had a little bit of a nervous breakdown, blamed Spider-Man, found some of his father's technology and Goblin formula, injected himself, and served as the second Green Goblin, which really put Spider-Man in a bind because he quickly found out this Goblin was Harry, and since Harry was his best friend in his civilian life as Peter Parker, he found himself torn about how to handle Harry as the Green Goblin, because it was not a simple matter for Peter on an emotional and psychological level to just punch him out, throw him in jail. Eventually, Harry would regain his sanity, retired the Green Goblin suit, briefly brought it back to serve in a heroic role supporting Spider-Man, retired it again, married, had a child he named after his father, Norman Osborn II, or Normie for short. Not even really for short, just as an alternate to Norman, and to help kind of distinguish things when you talk about things. There's Norman and there's Normie. But, yeah, had a wife and a child. Later, had a second nervous breakdown, became a villainous Green Goblin again for a brief period before seemingly dying. In the original storyline, he did die and stayed that way for many years until the Brand New Day event occurred, and among several things it changed. It was said that Harry did not die. The Goblin formula, like Norman before him had, kept Harry alive at the edge of death, and Norman took him away, where Harry spent time healing in both mind and body. Since then, Harry has not embraced any costumed identity, has in fact gone out of his way to distance himself from his father, and any and all costumed shenanigans. Although it has been shown in recent issues that Harry, for some not yet fully explained reason, keeps some goblin tech where he can get at it. So we may one day see a heroic Harry don the Green Goblin suit again, or maybe he will once again suffer a lapse of sanity. We don't know. This is an ongoing storyline. Now, during the time period in which Harry was working on regaining his sanity while being mostly villainous, his psychiatrist at the mental institution, a Dr. Bart Hamilton, briefly took up the identity of the Green Goblin after using his position as Harry's doctor to get Harry to reveal to him where the equipment was being kept. You know, these things happen. Apparently, criminal psychologists in the comic book universe aren't very sane themselves. See DC's Harleen Quinzel, aka Harley Quinn. Now, Bart Hamilton did not last very long as Green Goblin. He basically has a couple misadventures, and then Harry breaks out of the institution and battles Hamilton for the rights to the Green Goblin identity, and Dr. Bart Hamilton is accidentally killed via pumpkin bomb. So he's kind of a footnote in the Goblin history, but it is important because he is the first non-Osborn to take the Green Goblin suit. Now, this would be repeated by our number 4 Green Goblin, Philip Benjamin Urich, or Phil Urich for short. Now, Phil Urich is the nephew of Ben Urich, a longtime friend of Spider-Man and a few other New York-based superheroes. Phil Urich operated as the Green Goblin as a superhero. Having stumbled across one of Harry Osborn's old Goblin hideouts, he finds a new variant of the Goblin formula that does not cause him to go insane like the two Osborns we have mentioned. Unfortunately, due to his youth and inexperience and desperation to prove himself as a hero, he was not a very successful at it and was often seen by a lot of experienced heroes as being just as maniacal and out of control as a lot of the villains Phil attempted to take down. Phil's turn as the Green Goblin would be stopped during the Onslaught event when the equipment he had found in Harry's safe house was damaged, while Phil fought Sentinels that had been reprogrammed by Onslaught to serve as his backup, which meant no fancy equipment, including the equipment that gave him the safer short-term doses of the Goblin formula. No superhero career. However, sometime later, Phil Urich did take on a villainous career, which we're going to kind of come back around to in a minute, because I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves. These things happen. Now, as I said, that pretty much covers us for Green Goblins. There have been a few short-term robots that were used mostly by Norman Osborn to throw people off finding out that he was the Green Goblin. But as far as actual characters with personalities and motivations, that covers the Green Goblin line. Now we're going to jump to the second Goblin line, and the one that is the most populated. Really, everything after here is kind of a miscellaneous category as our third big branch. But this would be the Hobgoblin. Now, the Hobgoblin thing's kind of weird. We're going to kind of jump around a bit and get away from some of the intricacies because of the way the Hobgoblin identity was written. I'm going to give you a quick summary before we get into the actual individual characters. The Hobgoblin was originally presented as a mystery villain. The readers were never shown who the Hobgoblin was. There were hints given pointing to a handful of different characters. However, the original writer left the Spider-Man books before revealing the identity. The identity was subsequently revealed by a different writer, though this was later retconned to be an imposter, as the identity was basically revealed just to set up having a brand new Hobgoblin take up the role. And again, we will get into the details of that in a moment. Who the original Hobgoblin was revealed many years later when the original writer came back to basically finish the storyline he never wrote. They produced a one-shot story where the original Hobgoblin, who was revealed to have, after the death of his big impersonator, gone into hiding and retirement with his mostly illegally obtained fortune. However, when it seems like he might get his identity as the original Hobgoblin revealed, he is lured back into action as the Hobgoblin, which ironically led to him being beaten and unmasked by Spider-Man. Thus, his identity was revealed by his own actions, which were an attempt to prevent his identity from being revealed. As I said, a little bit ironic. So, having said all that, because it does kind of get the core of besides the color scheme, where Hobgoblin did more of an orange and yellow approach, where Green Goblin was green and purple, it does get to the core of how they tried to make the Hobgoblin a little bit of a different character. The readers knew from pretty much the get-go that the original Green Goblin was Norman Osborn, and the subsequent Goblins were always shown starting their careers. So for the readers, there never was a mystery. Whereas with Hobgoblin, there was a mystery for an extended period. So right there from the get-go, there was that attempt to distinguish the two goblins. But as I said, writers leave, plot threads are picked up by other writers with some different ideas, and things happen. That's the nature of a shared universe. We're not going to say whether it's good or bad. So real quick, here's your Hobgoblin line. We have the original Hobgoblin, the one who managed to hide his identity for many years, Roderick Kingsley, an amoral billionaire fashion designer who, as I said, was, in the long run, has shown to be a little bit more of a cowardly villain, as he focuses almost 100% on obtaining money from his criminal schemes, does not get into the personal revenge stuff that the various Green Goblin characters did. Now, the first person that Roderick Kingsley set up as an impersonator was a petty thug named Lefty Donovan. Donovan's exposure to the Goblin formula, and specifically kind of an experimental version of it, because as I said, Kingsley himself would modify the Goblin formula before taking it. So Lefty Donovan was kind of his prototype guinea pig. Lefty Donovan suffered from facial disfigurement, although he did get granted the superhuman abilities that the Goblin formula commonly does. When Lefty Donovan finds himself captured by Spider-Man and unmasked by him, he starts talking about how he has a boss who is behind this whole Hobgoblin thing. However, said boss, aka Roderick Kingsley, although again this was not known at the time, took control of the Goblin glider remotely and caused it to crash into the side of a building, killing Lefty with the falling rubble. The main imposter, and the one who was for many years thought to just flat out be the original Hobgoblin, was Ned Leeds, a reporter that worked for the Daily Bugle alongside Peter Parker, and was routinely brainwashed by Roderick Kingsley to act as a stand-in to fool the underworld and Spider-Man into thinking he was the real Hobgoblin, so Roderick Kingsley could continue to operate behind the scenes. Ned Leeds is later murdered by the Foreigner after Kingsley decided he was no longer needed. Now, it should be interesting to note that because the Hobgoblin identity had never been revealed in a dramatic unmasking type scene, that when Ned Leeds was killed, he was killed as Ned Leeds in a Spider-Man Wolverine crossover miniseries. The regular monthly Spider-Man book picked up on this plot point a couple issues after the miniseries concluded and revealed that the reason Ned Leeds was seemingly killed at random was because he was actually the Hobgoblin and his murderer was the Foreigner and his henchmen. Here's where it gets fun. With Roderick Kingsley slinking off into retirement and long-term non-consensual stand-in Ned Leeds now murdered, Jason Macendale, who had been operating as the low-tier, not very well-respected villain Jack-O-Lantern, which itself eventually became a legacy identity, But we're not going to spin too far into that this week. Managed to obtain the Hobgoblin equipment and became the third Hobgoblin, not counting Lefty's one shot. Not fully agreed upon turn as the Hobgoblin. And reigned as the Hobgoblin for many years, longer than Roderick Kingsley's original turn as the Unknown Hobgoblin. Unfortunately, Jason Macendale found himself not living up to the original legacy of the Hobgoblin as one of the top-tier villains in New York due to repeated losses to Spider-Man, which usually concluded with him getting unmasked. Macendale is a bit of a publicly known Hobgoblin, along with being beaten by a few other characters. He would get so desperate that he would actually make a deal with a demon to have his power boosted, specifically by having a lesser demon bonded to him. And we're going to circle back around to that one in a minute, I promise. But just note that he was temporarily mystically empowered as Hobgoblin, although that faded away. Jason Macendale finally got his comeuppance when he was murdered by the returning Roderick Kingsley, who, upon coming out of retirement to make sure his identity stayed secret, and as I pointed earlier, ironically revealing it to the world, murdered Jason Macendale mostly to send a message to the world that the original Hobgoblin, not this pathetic wannabe Hobgoblin, was back. As I said, Jason Macendale, he was kind of a schmuck as Hobgoblin, but he did hold the identity for the longest run. So, you know, props to that. He had a good extended run as the Hobgoblin, longer than his run as Jack-o'-lantern. Now, during Roderick's time, both in his original run and since his return as Hobgoblin, he would have his twin brother Daniel serve as both a stand-in for Roderick while Roderick was the Hobgoblin, and later as the Hobgoblin while Roderick was just walking around as Roderick. Now, Daniel Kingsley would unfortunately come to an end when he is murdered by the next person to take up the Hobgoblin identity. Here we go, folks. You ready? We're circling it back around, going forward this time. Phil Urich! It seems that after a bit of time in retirement as the Green Goblin, Phil Urich would find himself just unable to make it in life as a civilian. Couldn't get the girl he was in love with, couldn't get a really good paying job. So he started to get desperate. He started to get dangerous. He started to miss the world of costumed peoples, even if he was no longer really capable of being heroic about it. Phil Urich would stumble across a Goblin safe house and featuring upgraded versions of the Goblin glider and most famously a flaming sword accessory weapon, and battle Daniel Kingsley over it. Phil Urich would win the battle, remove Daniel Kingsley's head, and take on the role as the next villainous Hobgoblin, thus cementing the fact that in the long run, no Goblin ever stays good for very long. He would torment various people as the Hobgoblin for a while, before finding himself serving under Norman and his Goblin Nation, where Norman, using this Green Goblin suit but referring to himself as Goblin King, Phil would use this upgraded Hobgoblin and refer to himself as the Goblin Knight. When Norman himself eventually got taken down and incarcerated, Phil would begin referring to himself as the Goblin King as well. However, his end would come when Norman, during his period wielding the Carnage symbiote and calling himself Red Goblin, would find Urich raiding one of Osborn's old clubs trying to acquire new Goblin weaponry to keep upgrading himself and cement his position as Goblin King. Got his heart ripped out of his chest by the Red Goblin, showing Norman had now truly become more dangerous than ever. Although, again, Norman would eventually be defeated as the Red Goblin, though Phil would not be the only casualty. However, that's a completely different story in and of itself. We're not going to go into super big details about Norman's time as the Red Goblin, because in discussing all the build-up to that, it really would be its own episode of how we went from Goblin King, which really was Norman's ultimate plan as the Green Goblin, to ending up cured of the Goblin formula, becoming the Red Goblin, and losing that power set to his, as I said, current status quo of being stuck in a mental institution. But yes, Phil Urich is no longer with us. So he is no longer Hobgoblin, Goblin Knight, or Goblin King. Now, that means currently we do not have a full-time Hobgoblin. Roderick Kingsley is still around. However, having suffered a couple near-death experiences himself, along with the death of his twin brother Daniel and his butler Claude, who impersonated Roderick Kingsley as Hobgoblin one time when confronting Norman during his Goblin King phase, Roderick's decided pretty much he is staying in the shadows behind the scenes and not getting involved in costumed fights with people. Which, even though it does make him come off kind of cowardly, ultimately proves Roderick may be the smartest supervillain in Marvel Comics, because he knows when it's like, okay, a little too much heat, I'm going to back off and not get killed right now, because I don't like getting killed. Now, I did name drop the Goblin King identity, which was used by both Norman and Phil, along with Phil's original identity as the Goblin Knight. This is going to lead us into our final branch of the Goblin identities, which is your miscellaneous category. It was revealed in a story that is pretty much completely criticized as being bad, that many years ago, before Norman Osborn killed Spider-Man's original long-term serious girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, which, you know, is a thing. We're not going to get into the Gwen MJ debate right now. That is definitely an episode that could run its own entire rambling. Or debate that could run its own episode, that too. But basically, that Norman himself had a physically intimate relationship with Gwen Stacy, and she not only subsequently got pregnant, but gave birth to twins of the one gender each identity. I know. People are going, there's more than two gender. Classic cisgender male, cisgender female set of twins. Okay? Moving on. Not getting into the gender debate thing right now. But still. Twins, non-identical. What's the term? Fraternal, I think, is right. Yeah. Sounds right, but the non-identical twins. Gabriel and Sarah. They would return as adults thanks to Norman's genetic manipulations of them, causing them to age rapidly. He would continue to manipulate them into thinking it was Spider-Man that had killed their mother, Gwen. When it's all said and done, Gabriel takes on some modified Goblin equipment and costume, calling himself the Grey Goblin. Is beaten by Spider-Man, is later found to be amnesic and in the care of his generally sane sister Sarah. He returns one more time after that little epilogue story, which confirms that he was alive but is amnesic and not really much of a current threat. He showed up one more time in the American Son miniseries, in which Norman tried to manipulate both Gabriel and Harry into kind of competing to be the next Iron Patriot. However, Harry, as I said before, had no interest in it, and Gabriel is a schmuck and really a character nobody likes. So when it was all said and done, Gabriel went to jail. Harry did not take up the identity of American Son. And Norman went on to scheme new schemes. One of the big major changes brought by Brand New Day was, besides the revelation that Harry was alive, sane, and had no interest in anything Goblin related, was the appearance of a new Goblin who had a costume color scheme similar to Gabriel, causing a brief tease that this would be a new Grey Goblin. However, the character, who was also apparently female, took on the codename Menace. Menace was revealed to be Harry's fiancée, Lily Hollister, who later dumped Harry to work with Norman and was one of the major generals in his previously mentioned Goblin Nation army. Menace herself was subsequently cured of her own Goblin formula and subsequent insanity. She has currently been shown to also be suffering from a bit of, if not full-blown amnesia, selective amnesia. Thus, she does not remember anything from her time as Menace. Should be noted that, unlike the other Goblins up until this point, Menace did not have a costume. She would physically transform from Lily to her scary monster-esque Menace form, thus kind of putting her like a halfway between Hulk and Goblin thing. It was an interesting take on the Goblin legacy, for sure. Having a character that it wasn't a simple matter of ripping a mask off, but them physically transforming so they could keep their identity secret a lot easier. And there was, in fact, originally a bit of mystery around who Menace was before the reveal of Lily Hollister. Now, this brings us to our final entrant in the Goblin legacy, and that is a bit of a... Remember when we pulled back for a minute and said we'd come back to it? Well, now we're doing it one more time. Whew. A little too much back and forth there. Getting old. Can't just do the whole roller coaster routine too often, too quick. Remember when I said that Jason McIndale, in desperation to be a bigger, better, badder hobgoblin, sold his soul, getting it bonded to a demon? Well, as I said, eventually he realized the bad decision he made, and was separated from the demon. The demon itself would stick around on Earth, and due to the time it spent bonded to Jason McIngale as Hobgoblin, appeared in a goblin-esque form, although his face was more demonic looking owing to what it really was, and the being started referring to itself as Demo-Goblin, the demon goblin. Instead of using a technologically derived glider and pumpkin bombs, had a glider made out of hellfire and similar hellfire-based pumpkin bombs. Demo-Goblin would only appear a handful of times in the 90s. Although most interestingly, he had a bit of a difference from various other goblins in that even though he was considered a villain, as he did murder people and did not show any remorse for it, as well as causing, any kind of collateral damage, destruction that was necessary, Demo-Goblin specifically, for some reason that was not 100% understood, managed to not only find its form a little bit altered from what it originally was, thanks to the time spent with Jason McIngale, but apparently got a weird idea in its head that it was going to be a heroic demon, and the various beings it primarily targeted were other demons. Demo-Goblin basically believing if he killed enough demons causing problems on Earth, that it could ascend and become a better class of sentient supernatural thing instead of simply going back to hell. This would be proven when Demo-Goblin met its final demise in one of Venom's various miniseries it got during the 90s. No, excuse me. That was Venom the Enemy Within. Was not the final time. It was Demo-Goblin's final time being a blatant hero-inspired character, even though, again, he tended to be a little murderous to it. I know I keep bouncing between he and it. Demo-Goblin was portrayed as a masculine character, thus I kind of want to say he, even though by strict definitions, demons should not have gender. So I also say it when I can consciously remember. Try not to focus too much on the pronouns. But, excuse me, Demo-Goblin appeared one more time after that miniseries, in which Demo-Goblin's physical form is killed in a final showdown with the Jason McIngale Hobgoblin. Demo-Goblin dies trying to save a child from collapsing debris inside the church where they were fighting, where Demo-Goblin's physical form is crushed to death. Thus, it proved that even though it was originally a hell-spawned creature and did help Jason McIngale commit more and more evil acts during the time they were bonded, that even if it didn't quite understand how to do it by most standards, Demo-Goblin did attempt to reform. So, kind of inspiring. Maybe it is possible for a goblin to go good instead of break bad, like poor Phil did. Poor Phil. He just wanted to not fail at everything in life. Now, besides these people that officially had full-blown goblin identities, I did mention earlier the Goblin Nation, which besides Norman, Phil, and Menace as the top-ranking superpowered ones, there were various street thugs that Norman had culled from different gangs around New York who were given who were given knockoff goblin masks to protect their identity. Norman also had a few other short-term pawn groups, the Cult of Goblin, and then during the time following Norman's stint as head of the government, but before he broke out and resumed his full-blown villainous career, there was a movement called Goblin Gangs, various loosely affiliated gangs popping up all over North America. They would get a tattoo, usually on their arm, of the Green Goblin head, and basically worked to try and figure out a way to get Norman out of jail, as they believed he had been right the whole time, that the heroes weren't actually all that heroic, and specifically the big socio-political thing Norman tried to push that resulted in him finally getting ousted from his position as government-endorsed head of the hero community, getting Thor and the rest of the Asgardians removed from the mortal realm. Yeah, that was the thing. Kind of an interesting story, all things considered, but not the wisest idea Norman ever had. Which wraps us up. You know? Honestly, I thought about it, and if you look at the three divisions there of Green Goblins, Hobgoblins, and your miscellaneous, spin-off identities there, the Goblin concept is one of the most legacied, if not the most legacied identity in American comic books. I mean, there's been a lot of Goblins. Some of them have held multiple identities, and they're not done. As I said, Roderick is not currently active as Hobgoblin, but he has shown he is willing to put other people in the suit to continue the legacy. If you were to actually make sure somebody was trained up and had some base level superpowers to start with to hold their own in a fight, he could manipulate a long-term Goblin impersonator to some level of success. As long as Norman's alive, there's a chance he's going to put the Green Goblin suit back on. Harry's, as we said, is alive and has at least some Goblin equipment under his custody. Or who knows, somebody else might just find one of these old safe houses or fashion their own Goblin equipment and take the Green Goblin identity in another direction. Maybe we'll get other one-off Goblins. Have a whole Goblin Rainbow Corps, Blue Goblin, Yellow Goblin, which I guess would kind of be Hobgoblin, even though he's primarily Orange Goblin. Bring back a Red Goblin that's not Carnage symbiote bonded. The base concept is so adaptable and malleable, and no matter what form it takes or who takes it on, it is always a pain in the rear for everybody's favorite arachnid-powered buddy, the Amazing Spider-Man. So, join us next week. We're probably not going to be talking about Peter Parker, but I make no promises. In the meantime, keep an eye on Roulette Productions. Subscribe to the channel if you do not currently. Do not forget about the Tuesday night game streams, which get archived on Wednesday morning. Friday Ramblings will be here every Friday. And as always, if you have a subject you would like me to approach that is pop culture and is generally positive, because we are not here to tear things down, feel free to shoot the suggestion to us. Mention it in the comment threads. I'm always happy to hear topic ideas, because otherwise I got to come up with them every week by myself. And then there's no promise what you folks will get. So, I will see you face to face in 7. You will hear me on Tuesday. Until then, stay positive, stay constructive with your criticism, and enjoy your life. Because peace and love to y'all. Bye-bye.